Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm doing a refresh of a video that I made well over a year ago now about the best planes for beginners in Microsoft Flight Sim. That video is still one of my more popular videos on the channel, but a lot has changed since it was released, such as new airplanes, improvements to the flight model, and more. I thought it would be a good time to give a slightly different take on that first video by looking at the easiest and hardest planes to fly in the sim. I decided to break it out into categories, and for each one of those categories, I'm going to give you a few easy planes to fly and a few difficult planes to fly. Just like in that first video, the categories I'm going to be covering are bush planes, prop planes, turboprops, and jets. I've restricted the list of airplanes to those that come with the standard version of the game because I want to make sure this list is as inclusive as possible, and I know that a lot of you out there who are just getting started are trying it on Xbox Game Pass and only have the standard version. I won't look at third-party planes for the same reason, and on top of that, there would be too many to include anyways because there are so many great planes out there that you can buy. Alright, with all of that said, let's start looking at the easiest and hardest planes to fly in Flight Sim. I'm going to start by looking at bush planes, which are planes that you would use typically for accessing remote or underdeveloped areas like the north of Canada or the Australian outback. The definition of a bush plane is pretty broad and it can include almost any general aviation airplane, but I'm specifically talking about the shorter range airplanes that are piston based with a high wing and good short runway performance. My pick for easiest to fly in this category is the Cub Crafter's NX Cub. It features a glass cockpit that makes it easy for newcomers to pick up the basic concepts of flight and how to read all of the different instruments. And if you follow the default tutorials, you should be pretty comfortable with this one as well. The NX Cub has a traditional tricycle landing gear, which makes it easy when you're on the ground to see where you're going, but it also simplifies takeoff and landing when you're flying in and out of short runways. It's fairly slow with its cruise speed of about 110 knots, making it ideal for learners to practice maneuvers that they'll have to have a good grasp on before flying the bigger and faster planes. The harder plane to fly in the bush trip category is the X Cub. It also has a glass cockpit like the NX Cub, so navigation is going to be fairly simple. Where the X Cub gets more difficult to fly is the fact that it's a tail dragger. It makes visibility out of the cockpit and seeing where you're going much less obvious. For takeoffs, you have to rely on peripheral vision to see where you're going because you can't see straight ahead until you've gotten to a certain airspeed. And ideally for landing, you're touching down with all three wheels at once. Accomplishing that takes a lot of practice though, so you can just land on the main front gear first, but it's a different experience and technique than landing most of the other airplanes in the game which have a tricycle landing gear. The X-Cub doesn't really provide a boost in airspeed though, so if you want to get somewhere faster, you're gonna have to look at the next category of airplane. That next step up from bush planes are prop planes. I'm also including turbocharged piston engine planes in this category, which aren't to be confused with turboprop planes, which I'll be looking at in just a little bit. Two of the easiest planes to fly in Flight Sim are the Cessna 172 and the Diamond DA40. Both airplanes are very stable in good and slightly windy weather conditions, making them ideal to start exploring different scenarios in Flight Sim. They both have the G1000 glass cockpit, which makes it easy to get situated and navigate from one place to another with ease. On top of that, the DA40 has a very simplified throttle quadrant as well. All you need to worry about is the throttle and it'll take care of the rest for you. Incidentally, if you do want to learn about all the functionality of the G1000, I've got you covered with the basics across a playlist that I've created that covers all of the instruments within it. I'll add a link to it right above me and in the description below. I can hear some of you saying already that the Cessna 152 is an easy plane to learn on as well, and that is absolutely true. I decided to exclude it since it is a little bit slower than the other two airplanes, and with its traditional steam gauges, it makes for a much larger learning curve for newcomers. Once you've gotten pretty good at flying the Cessna 172 and the DA40, you can move on to two harder prop planes, and that's the Beechcraft Bonanza and the Diamond DA62. Both planes have the G1000 cockpit as well, but that's about where the comparisons between them ends. The Bonanza is a speed demon with a top cruise speed of close to 170 knots, but it also takes a little bit of practice to manage it properly on takeoff and landing. It's also got a few features that make it a little bit more complex to fly, such as retractable landing gear and especially the prop and mixture controls. They aren't hard things to master by any stretch of the imagination, but when you're just getting started, it's easy to get bogged down in all of the little details and not enjoy the flying experience as much. It's a similar story for the DA62, but it's even more complex because it's got two engines. Managing an extra engine doesn't seem like a big deal at first, but there are some significant differences which I've covered in a previous video, and I'll make sure to link to that one as well. That second power plant makes the DA62 a fast airplane as well, and you need to plan ahead of time what you're going to be doing with it because everything happens a whole lot faster. Once you've mastered these two more complex prop planes, you're pretty much ready to move on to turboprops. Before I look at turboprop planes though, I do want to remind you, if you get some value from this video, please make sure to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. A turboprop airplane is really a lot closer to being a jet than you might realize. It has a pressurized cabin, which means it can travel at a lot higher altitudes than a prop plane, and the engine shares more characteristics with a jet engine than it does with a piston-based engine. There aren't many turboprop options in flight sim. There's only the Cessna 208 Grand Caravan, the Daewoo TBM 930, and the King Air 350. Of the three, there's really only one that I consider easy to fly, and that's the Cessna. It feels like a bigger and faster version of the Cessna 172, and it makes for a really easy transition because it has the same G1000 glass cockpit. In terms of airspeed, it's about on par with the Bonanza that I was looking at a few minutes ago, but it feels a lot easier to control than the Bonanza. Both the TBM and the King Air are much more difficult to fly. Both have low wings, which I always find a little bit more challenging because I'm used to usually flying airplanes with high wings, but the upgraded avionics of the G3X take a lot of getting used to compared to the G1000 that you're probably used to with the Cessnas. Both airplanes are faster than the Grand Caravan, and for short cross-country hops, they can really get you where you're going in a nick of time. But that extra speed comes at the cost of having to plan a little bit more how you're going to fly them and practice a whole lot more to be proficient at flying them. In other words, you can't just load into the cockpit of the TBM or the King Air and expect to be able to fly them well from day one. It's also hard to say which is harder, the TBM or the King Air. The TBM is faster and definitely seems to have a little bit more kick to its power plant, but the King Air has two engines and that always makes things a little bit more complicated and challenging too. Either way, they're both a lot harder to fly than the Grand Caravan. Last but not least, I'm going to give some picks for the easiest and hardest jets to fly in the sim. I'm combining the jet and airliner sections because there are limited choices in the standard version of the game. I also want to preface this by saying that I am not an expert when it comes to jets. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you know that I spend almost all of my time in the general aviation airplanes in flight sim, so take whatever I say with a grain of salt. This may come as a bit of a strange pick, but in terms of an easy jet to fly, I'm actually going to recommend using the F-18. The flight model for the F-18 is highly watered down from what you would expect in a real-life airplane, but it can be a lot of fun to just take off and start exploring around an area and just be able to explore it a lot faster than you can with a general aviation plane. And of course, if you really want, you can fly low to the ground or between buildings to do your best Maverick impersonation. Takeoffs in the F-18 are pretty easy, and the same goes for just flying around somewhere. Landings do take a little bit more work, and they take a little bit of getting used to because it is pretty different from landing a general aviation airplane, but overall it isn't too hard and you should be able to get it right with just a few practice runs. In terms of a more difficult airplane to fly in the jet category, that's where I'd recommend the Airbus A320. The default A320 is missing a lot of features in it, and it's not really as realistic as possible. So this is actually the only occasion that I'm gonna recommend that you get a freeware version of the A320. Fly-by-Wire have been working on this open source project for the A320 for a long time now, and from all the other videos and streamers that I watched it fly, they all seem to really enjoy the mod. The mod is going to make the flight model a lot more realistic, and it's going to enable a bunch of features inside of the cockpit that don't exist in the default version in the sim. I'll include a link to the Fly-by-Wire website where you can download it for free. Now there's also a mod that you can get for the 747, which is the Heavy Division mod, but from what I can see on the GitHub project, it doesn't seem like it's being maintained anymore. For that reason, I'd recommend staying away from it. This is my software development hat that I'm wearing right now, but any project on GitHub that isn't actively maintained is never a good idea to get involved in. And that's going to do it for my tour of the easiest and hardest planes to fly in Microsoft Flight Sim. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you got some value, I will remind you again to please make sure to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. I'll see you in the next video.